Welcome to Dark Horror Diaries, my friend. Before the show starts, do write below where are you from. Let's go. I've always been the logical one, the type who believes in facts, figures, and reason. That's what made my job as a data analyst so appealing. My entire world ran on numbers and clear, rational thinking. But the moment Emily asked me to house sit her new property in upstate New York, everything I knew about control, reason, and the world around me started to unravel. The house was massive. Old Victorian style with dark wooden beams and windows that seemed to peer out at you like eyes watching your every move. The kind of place where creaks in the floorboards sent a chill down your spine. I wasn't one for superstition, so I shrugged off the eeriness. But as I walked through the hallway on my first night, I couldn't ignore the silence that filled the house. It was unsettling. No noises from outside, no neighbors, just the endless, suffocating quiet. I had been to Emily's before, but this time felt different. She'd recently inherited the property from a distant relative, and after some quick renovations, had decided to leave for a business trip, leaving me alone in this giant, creaky structure. I was supposed to enjoy the solitude, maybe get some work done. What I didn't expect was to be haunted by what was left behind by the house's past. The first night was uneventful, or so I thought. I had a dream, though, one that made my skin crawl. In it, I stood in a room draped in shadows, staring at a woman in black ceremonial robes. She was whispering in a language I couldn't understand, moving slowly around a circle of flickering candles. I couldn't make out her face, but the intensity of her gaze was unmistakable. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart racing, but I dismissed it. Stress, I thought. It had to be stress from my new job, or maybe the unfamiliarity of the house. Nothing more than that. But it wasn't over. The dreams kept coming, each time more vivid. The woman grew closer, her voice more distinct, the whispers cutting into my mind. It wasn't the usual kind of nightmare that faded once I opened my eyes. This was different, like something inside the house was slowly worming its way into my thoughts, leaving behind something that felt wrong. I decided to confront my fear, or maybe my growing unease, the following night. But when I was woken from a deep sleep by what sounded like footsteps above me, I knew something wasn't right. The house, despite its age and creaks, was supposed to be empty. I checked the attic, my heart pounding with each step, but found nothing. When I returned to bed, I noticed the door to the closet, which I was sure had been shut, was now slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat as I approached, noticing a dark stain on the floor beneath it. Fresh, as if something had been dragged across the wood. I didn't know what to think. There was no explanation. I called Emily the next morning, hoping she would shed some light on this. She hesitated before admitting something that only added to the chaos swirling in my head. The house, she said, had a history, a dark one. In the late 1970s, it had been owned by a secretive group that called themselves the Children of the Crimson Veil. They had vanished overnight, with only rumors about their horrific practices and human sacrifices. The basement, Emily told me, had been sealed off when she inherited the house. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I wanted to laugh it off, tell myself that this was just a relic of a forgotten era, a ghost story built from urban legends. But the stain on the floor, the whispers in the dark, they didn't fit with anything rational. And when I found the hidden entrance to the basement while organizing some old boxes, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The trapdoor had been scratched, worn down as if someone had desperately tried to claw their way out. I couldn't help myself. I descended into the darkness. The basement was colder than I expected. As my foot creaked against the old wooden steps, I felt an unease settle in the pit of my stomach. It was as though the house itself was exhaling its breath, a heavy, ancient sigh that made the darkness feel thicker. The air was stale, thick with dust, and the faint, unpleasant scent of something decaying. The beams overhead creaked under the weight of time, and the soft flicker of my flashlight cast long, wavering shadows along the stone walls. At first, I thought it was just a regular basement, full of old furniture, forgotten boxes, and the occasional relic of a past long gone. But there was something off about this one. The stone altar was the first thing I noticed. It was large, almost grotesquely so, covered in dried blood that had long since darkened into a crusty, blackened stain. The candles around it were black, their wax melted into strange, disturbing shapes, their presence somehow commanding. I couldn't look at them for too long, but I could feel their weight in the air like they were watching me. My hand shook as I pointed the flashlight at the wall, And that's when I saw the symbols. They were carved into the stone with a brutal precision, jagged lines that seemed to pulse in the faint light. The symbols mirrored the ones in my dreams. The woman in the black robes, the whispering voices. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step closer to the altar. There was a mummified corpse sitting in a rotting wooden chair beside it, its ceremonial robes in tatters, leather restraints still attached to the arms of the chair. I recoiled, taking a step back, but that was when the candles flickered to life. The sudden burst of flame sent a shock of panic through me. They hadn't been lit when I entered, and now they burned with a strange, otherworldly intensity. The smell of melting wax filled the air, but it was the voice behind me that nearly sent me over the edge. It was soft, a whisper that seemed to come from all around me, but there was a chilling clarity to the words. "You were not supposed to find this." I froze. My mind screamed at me to run to escape, but my body couldn't move. The voice seemed to wrap itself around my thoughts, suffocating me in its presence. Slowly, I turned, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing in the doorway of the basement, was the woman from my dreams. The one in the black ceremonial robes. Her face was obscured, but there was something about her that was unmistakable. The anguish in her posture, the way her body trembled with the weight of something far older than human. For a moment, everything seemed to go still. The world outside the basement didn't exist anymore. Just the heavy, suffocating air and the woman standing before me, her voice now growing louder in my mind. The whispers continued to echo, though I couldn't understand them. They were as frantic as they were desperate, calling out for something or someone. I felt my body moving before my mind could react. I stumbled backward, my legs tangling with the altar, knocking over one of the black candles. It fell to the floor with a sickening thud, and the flame hissed out, leaving the room in total darkness for a heartbeat. My flashlight flickered as I desperately tried to keep it steady, but all I could hear was the whisper growing louder, demanding. "One must be offered," the woman intoned, her voice now resonating through my very bones. "It is your turn." I didn't know what she meant, but the terror that surged through me told me I wasn't just being haunted by a ghost. This was something far worse. The entity, the cult. It all tied together in a way that I wasn't ready to comprehend. But I had no choice. I had to find a way out. I couldn't move. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, as though the very floor was pulling me into its dark embrace. The woman's presence loomed at the doorway, though her face remained hidden in shadows. The chill in the air tightened, and I could feel it closing in around me. A voice, not her voice, but something deeper, reverberated through my head, its tone like something ancient, something primal. "Why are you still here?" it asked, the words slithering into my thoughts like a snake. I tried to answer, but my mouth was dry, my words choking in my throat. All I could manage was a gasp, my breath shallow and ragged. The flashlight flickered again, casting brief moments of illumination that only served to deepen the shadows in the corners of the room. Each pulse of light revealed the grotesque altar, the melted candles, the mummified corpse. Each detail more disturbing than the last. I couldn't stop myself from looking back at the woman. There was something magnetic about her, something that felt as though it was pulling me toward her, compelling me to step closer despite every instinct screaming to run. And then I saw it, her eyes. Or what should have been her eyes. The blackness that should have been void, but in those fleeting moments of light, I swore I could see the faintest shimmer of something more, something alive. The whispering increased in volume, and then, suddenly, everything went silent. I was alone in the basement. I could still feel her presence, but the woman was gone. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I slowly lowered the flashlight, my hands trembling. I didn't know whether it was the fear or the overwhelming need to understand what had just happened, but I reached out for the chair, the rotting seat beside the altar. The corpse. The leather restraints were still in place, as though someone had been left tied to that chair for far too long. I could feel the coldness of the room, the oppressive weight of what had happened here, and the knowledge that I was standing in the very place where it all began. I backed away, my mind reeling as the realization struck me. This was no ordinary haunting. The spirit, the woman in the robes, she wasn't just trying to scare me. She was trying to keep me here. Before I could turn to leave, something shifted in the corner of my eye. A shadow. No, not a shadow, but a shape. A figure. It was impossible to make out, a blur of darkness against the stone wall. But it moved. Slowly, almost deliberately. Toward me. My breath caught and panic surged. I wasn't alone anymore. I stumbled backward, my legs finally obeying as I scrambled to find the stairs. But the shadow wasn't just moving toward me. It was blocking the exit. The closer it got, the colder the air became, and the whispers swelled again, louder, almost deafening now. My heart raced, and I finally found my voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "Leave me alone," I begged, though I didn't believe it would work. I had seen enough, heard enough to know that begging would do nothing here. The shadow stopped. It stood still, just outside the beam of my flashlight, its form becoming clearer. I could see it now. Faint outlines of what appeared to be figures, their bodies twisted in ways that defied logic, their faces nothing more than shifting patches of darkness. They were watching me, waiting. "One must be offered," the voice whispered again, this time not from the woman in the robe, but from all around me. "The time has come." My blood ran cold as I realized the truth. This was not a mere haunting. It was a ritual, and I was the final offering. The door to my escape slammed shut, the sound of the wood cracking, as if the house itself had sealed me in. I was trapped. I backed into the altar, my body shaking. The shadows pressed in, and I felt something cold wrap around my throat. I was no longer alone. I couldn't breathe. The cold fingers around my throat tightened, as though the shadows themselves were choking the life out of me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow and desperate, but no matter how hard I gasped, it felt as if the air had vanished from the room. The whispers grew louder, crawling under my skin, wrapping around my mind like a thick, suffocating fog. "The offering is needed, now." They hissed, each word striking like a blow. The darkness before me began to swirl, coalescing into something more solid, something far more terrifying than the faint outline I had seen before. A figure emerged from the depths, its form indistinct, yet undeniably monstrous. It was as if the shadows had taken on a life of their own, stretching and contorting, becoming a hulking presence towering over me. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the void. The basement seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing inward, as though the house itself was alive, and it was eager for its final feast. The altar, once a mere stone structure, now felt like the epicenter of the nightmare. I could see the bloodstains more clearly now, the dried remnants of some forgotten ritual. The candles, though long extinguished, still cast faint remnants of light in strange, unnatural patterns. They glowed with an eerie light, illuminating the grotesque symbols on the walls. Symbols that I had seen in my dreams. Symbols that now made sense, and were far more sinister than I had realized. The figure before me seemed to be breathing, its chest heaving in time with the eerie rhythm of the whispers. But then it opened its mouth, and the words that spilled out were not words at all, but a sound, a low growl that vibrated through the very core of the house. "One must remain. One must be given." I tried to move, tried to back away, but my body wouldn't respond. My feet were rooted to the floor, my legs unable to carry me away from the horrors that surrounded me. I was frozen in place, caught in the web of terror the house had spun around me. The shadows shifted again, and I saw the woman. The robed figure, from my dreams. She was no longer a distant specter, but solid, standing before the altar. Her face was twisted, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly fire. "You cannot leave," she said, her voice colder than ice. "The ritual is not complete." My mind raced. How had this happened? How had I gotten trapped in this nightmare? The house had been a gift, a quiet weekend away from the chaos of the city, and now it was a tomb, one I would never escape. I tried to think of a way out, but all logic had vanished, swallowed by the madness that gripped my mind. The shadows inched closer, and I could feel the temperature drop, my breath turning to mist in the frigid air. "I'm not part of this," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "I didn't come here to be part of your ritual." "You are part of it now," the woman said, stepping closer. "You are the offering. You always were." Her words cut through me like a blade, and for a moment I felt the weight of their truth. The cult, the rituals, the disappearances. It had all led to this moment, and now it was my turn to be claimed. In a final surge of desperation, I grabbed the fire poker from beside the altar and swung it wildly at the figure in front of me. It passed right through her, as though she were made of smoke. But the act gave me a sense of purpose, a fleeting moment of clarity. The shadows hissed in anger, but I knew I had to fight. I couldn't let them take me. The air grew heavier, and a deep, resonant sound filled the basement. The low hum of something immense stirring. It was coming. The power, the entity that had been awakened, was close to breaking free. The ground trembled beneath my feet. The walls, once so solid, began to warp, and the altar crackled with energy. I didn't have much time. I needed to end this before it was too late. One must be offered. The voice boomed again, shaking the very foundation of the house. I gripped the poker tighter, my resolve hardening. I would not be their sacrifice. The moment my fingers tightened around the fire poker, the house seemed to breathe again. The walls groaned, the floorboards shifted beneath my feet. I could feel the darkness pressing in on all sides, its malevolent presence rising as the air grew heavier with every second. The altar crackled, and the symbols on the walls seemed to writhe, as if they were alive. But I didn't have time to think about that. The shadows were closing in, and I had only one chance to stop them. With a scream of defiance, I swung the poker at the altar. It struck the stone with a resounding crack, sending a shockwave through the room. The candles flared to life, their flames twisting and dancing as though they were alive. The shadows recoiled, but the robed woman, Miriam Vale, didn't move. Her eyes, glowing with that unnatural fire, locked onto mine. "You cannot destroy what has already been born," she hissed, her voice a low, anguished wail. "We are bound to this place, and you are bound to us." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I faltered. Was it true? Was I really part of this cursed house, part of its twisted legacy? But no, I couldn't accept that. Not now. Not when I could still feel the weight of the fire poker in my hand. Not when I could still fight. I swung again, this time aiming for the symbols carved into the stone. The poker hit the wall with a violent crash, and a deep, rumbling sound filled the room. The symbols shattered, splintering into jagged lines of light, and the ground trembled violently beneath my feet. The air thickened, charged with the energy of something ancient and powerful, but it was not enough to stop me. Miriam's form flickered, her image distorting, her face becoming a grotesque mask of agony and rage. She raised her hands, her fingers long and gnarled, twisting toward me with an impossible speed. "You think you can destroy what we've created," she screamed, her voice a mix of fury and desperation. "You cannot. We are eternal." I didn't listen. Instead, I raised the poker one last time, aiming directly for the heart of the altar. The air around me seemed to thrum with power, but I didn't hesitate. I drove the poker down, piercing the stone with all the force I could muster. For a moment, everything went silent. Then, a tremendous shock wave ripped through the basement. The house seemed to groan under the pressure, as if it were being torn apart from within. The symbols on the walls flared bright, blinding white, and the shadows writhed in violent, chaotic motions. Miriam's screams filled the room, a high-pitched, gut-wrenching wail that made my bones ache. The altar cracked and split, splintering into 1,000 pieces, and the air grew thick with the stench of burning flesh and sulfur. I staggered back, but my eyes were fixed on Miriam. Her form twisted and contorted, her body writhing as if it were being torn apart from the inside. Her mouth opened wide, emitting a terrible screech that felt like it was rattling my very soul. And then, in a final, explosive burst, her body disintegrated into ash, her scream lingering in the air like the remnants of a nightmare. The basement fell eerily silent. The ground stopped shaking, the oppressive weight of the house lifting as if something had been released. The candles snuffed out, leaving only the faint glow of the dying symbols on the walls. I could still feel the presence of something dark lingering, but it was no longer threatening. It was gone. I fell to my knees, my body trembling from the adrenaline, from the sheer terror that had gripped me. But even as I breathed a sigh of relief, I knew this wasn't over. Miriam's spirit may have been destroyed, but the house, the entity, the curse, it all lingered. It had left its mark on me. The house was still there, but it felt different now, less alive. The walls that had once seemed to breathe with malice now stood silent and still. But I could hear it in my mind, the whisper of a voice, faint but clear. The offering is still needed. I turned, my heart sinking, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't free. Not yet. I didn't know how much time passed after Miriam's destruction. My body felt heavy, the weight of everything crashing down around me as I struggled to make sense of what had just happened. The basement was silent, its once oppressive atmosphere now hollow and empty. But something inside me screamed, a nagging voice in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. I wasn't alone. I wasn't free. I forced myself to my feet, my legs shaky as I stumbled towards the stairs, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, any lingering trace of the darkness that had haunted me. But everything was still. The fire poker was lying on the ground, the symbols on the walls slowly fading, and the candles. Those candles lay cold and lifeless. I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the top, I noticed the door to the basement, once sealed shut, now hung loosely on its hinges. I stepped through it, my breath catching in my throat as I found myself standing in the hallway, the house stretching out before me like a living, breathing entity. The floors creaked beneath my feet, the walls seemed to whisper in the silence, and the shadows. The shadows were still moving. But it wasn't the shadows that caught my attention. It was the empty land outside the window. The house was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes, convinced it was a trick of the light, but when I looked again, it was true. The mansion, the cursed house that had held me captive for days, was no longer there. The woods that had once encroached upon the property were now open fields, the horizon stretching out in an unfamiliar direction. I ran outside, my legs carrying me faster than I thought possible. My breath was ragged, my mind spinning as I searched the empty space where the house had stood only moments before. There was no trace of it, no sign that it had ever existed. The ground was undisturbed, the grass swaying gently in the breeze. Then a voice, a deep, raspy whisper, carried through the air. The offering is still needed. My heart stopped. It wasn't Miriam's voice. It was something else. Something darker. I spun around, my eyes scanning the empty landscape, but there was nothing. No one, just the vast expanse of land stretching endlessly into the distance. My mind raced. How could this be? How could the house be gone, and yet the curse still linger? The ground beneath me trembled, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. The earth felt alive, as if it were pulsing with a strange, unnatural energy. I looked down, my fingers brushing against the soil, and that's when I saw it. A faint, glowing symbol, just like the ones in the basement, carved into the ground beneath me. It was the same symbol Miriam had used to summon the entity, the same symbol that had cursed the house. And then I heard it. A voice, not from behind me, but from inside my own mind. A whisper, cold and hollow, that echoed in the deepest corners of my thoughts. You cannot escape. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, and I gasped, clutching my heart as the world around me began to twist and warp. The ground buckled beneath me, the sky above darkened, and the trees that had once surrounded the house now seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air grew thick with a presence I couldn't name, but I could feel it, closing in on me, suffocating me. I was trapped. The house was gone, but the curse remained. It was alive, and it was waiting for me. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was the symbol on the ground, its glow fading to nothing, leaving only the silence of the land. And then, nothing. Last night, I swallowed a melatonin pill to help me sleep earlier than usual. It's something I rarely do, but my boyfriend had to work late again, and I wanted to get a good night's rest. Beside me, my American bully, who's terrified of almost everything, curled up on her bed beside mine. I don't expect her to be my protector. In fact, I've always felt more like her protector, and I'm perfectly fine with that. Around 10:55 p.m., she suddenly started barking like a mad dog, her voice rising in a frenzied pitch that shattered the calm night. I sighed, my head heavy from the melatonin already kicking in. Go back to bed, I muttered, turning my head against the pillow. But then, something strange happened. The doorbell rang. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was unrelenting, followed by persistent knocking that echoed through the house. It was coming from the front door. I froze. We never used the front door. Not once had we ever walked through it. My boyfriend always came through the garage, and I rarely opened the front door at all. I wondered for a moment if maybe his garage opener had broken. Maybe that's why he was at the front door. But there were no calls or texts from him. Nothing. I glanced at my dog, who was still in a panic. Something wasn't right. The knocking continued. My heart started to pound, and instinctively, I went downstairs with my dog in tow. As I approached the door, I noticed the small peephole. My only way to see outside without fully opening the door. I peered through it, trying to gauge what was happening. Then I heard it. A man's voice, weak and distant, but unmistakable. "Help me." I flinched. The voice sounded strained, as if the man were in distress. But who would be out there, so late at night, banging on my door? I thought for a moment. Maybe my boyfriend was playing some kind of joke on me, trying to scare me. But my dog wasn't playing along. She wasn't barking as she usually did when he got home. This was different. She was on edge, growling and snarling, her ears pinned flat. I hesitated, then unlocked the deadbolt and door handle. I cracked open the door just a couple of inches, just enough to see the man's figure in the dim light. He was standing there, trembling, muttering, "Help me, help me." I couldn't get a clear look at his face. His movements were erratic, and as soon as I opened the door, he began pulling at the doorknob, jerking it violently. My stomach twisted in knots. "What do you need help with?" I shouted through the small gap. The man didn't answer. He just kept tugging at the knob, his hands frantic. I could feel my dog growling like never before, sounding like a beast I'd never heard. I slammed the door shut with every ounce of strength I had, locking it again. My breath came out in short, sharp gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm calling the cops," I yelled, scrambling for my phone. My fingers fumbled as I dialed 911. Through the phone, I heard the doorbell ringing again. The man was still there, pounding relentlessly. The dispatcher on the other end of the line heard it too. Loud and clear. My mind raced. Should I have asked him what was going on? Why didn't he say something when the door opened? Why did he seem unaffected by my dog's frantic barking? Why did he continue to try and break in, even when I screamed at him? I felt guilty. I felt terrible. But all I knew was that there was a strange man at my door, acting erratically, and I didn't feel safe. The police arrived a few minutes later. I watched as they carefully approached the man, gently leading him to the back of their squad car. And then I saw it. The face of someone I recognized. It was my neighbor. The elderly man who lived across the street. I'd never spoken to him, and I'd barely seen him around, but there he was. His eyes wide and confused. Apparently, he had dementia. He had somehow gotten out of his house and wandered the neighborhood, lost and scared. I felt the weight of guilt settle into my chest. I had called the police on my own neighbor. The officer mentioned that his wife was frantic when they arrived. She had no idea where he had gone, and now she was shaken by the sight of her husband being taken to the hospital. They needed to get him checked out, and I could only imagine how terrifying the whole ordeal must have been for her. But still, I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. What if I'd opened the door fully? What if I'd let him in without understanding the real situation? I wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. I kept telling myself that I had done the best I could with the information I had at the time. A strange man at my door, acting erratically, and a dog who had never been this agitated before. I couldn't just ignore it. Now I just keep replaying the events in my head. I feel foolish for letting myself get so scared, for jumping to conclusions. I watch crime shows all the time, and my boyfriend works a demanding job. Sometimes he's not home until 4 a.m., so I was already on edge. But what if the man had been someone dangerous? What if I had done something wrong by opening the door just a crack? I guess I'll never know if I handled it the right way, but I tell myself I did what I thought was necessary at the time. It was the scariest night I've had in a long time, and I hope it stays that way. Just a creepy encounter that will fade into the past. It was the summer of my 15th year when I learned the weight of fear on a deeper level than I'd ever imagined. Living in a low-income trailer court, the neighborhood was a mix of families, mostly people of color like me, trying to make the best of what little we had. But even in the dim glow of streetlights, there was a constant undercurrent of danger that we couldn't escape. Child abduction attempts were all too common, some of which were successful, and it was a silent fear that hung in the air like a thick fog. That night, I was walking to meet up with 2 of my friends. We had planned to hang out, but walking there meant crossing through parts of the neighborhood that were known for their risk. I wasn't naive, I knew the area, but I didn't think much of it. It was only a 5 to 10 minute walk, and it was nothing I hadn't done before. I was small, barely 5'4", and a native girl, fit but slight. My body had always been quick, always alert, and I walked with a steady confidence. Earphones in, music blasting, I stepped into the street with little hesitation. The neighborhood was quiet, the air heavy and warm, and I told myself there was nothing to fear. As I turned the corner, I spotted my friends standing by the park, waiting for me. I waved at them, expecting the usual wave back, the playful banter we always shared. But they didn't wave. They were just standing there, staring at me. It was strange, unsettling even, and a sense of unease crawled up my spine. I pulled my earphones out and shouted their names. "Hey, what's up?" But instead of the usual greeting, they both frantically signaled for me to shut up and get to them. Their eyes were wide, their movements erratic. Confused, I laughed it off, thinking they were just being dramatic, maybe pulling a prank. But I picked up the pace, my curiosity piqued by their strange behavior. That's when it all changed. In an instant, they both bolted towards me. One of them ran past me, and the other pulled me into his arms. His voice, breathless and urgent, whispered into my ear, "That man was following you." I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Without thinking, I spun around. My blood ran cold. In the distance, I could see a man standing at the end of the street. He wasn't just standing there casually. He was staring directly at me. My friend who had run past me was now yelling at the man. "Why were you following her?" It was then I understood the severity of the situation. My pulse quickened as the three of us began running. I was begging my friend to turn around, to stop chasing the man. It didn't make sense. Why would we chase him? But he didn't listen, his eyes locked on the man, determination burning through him. My feet pounded the pavement as we ran after them, our voices lost in the frantic chase. The man wasn't stopping. My friend was relentless, shouting, trying to close the distance between them. The terror inside me spiraled, rising like bile in my throat. For what felt like an eternity, we ran through the streets. The man darted, zigzagging, as if he was toying with us. We kept going, running with everything we had. My mind raced through 100 thoughts at once. What if he had a weapon? What if he was just trying to get me alone? My breath came in ragged gasps, my body pushed to its limits. Then, just as quickly as the chase had begun, the man veered off into the forest a couple of blocks away. My friend skidded to a halt, his chest heaving, and I stumbled beside him, trying to catch my breath. It was over. He was gone. But the relief didn't come immediately. I stood there in the street, trembling, my legs weak beneath me. The adrenaline left me like a rush of cold water. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared down the street where the man had disappeared. The silence that followed was deafening. That's when I broke down. The two boys, who had been so brave, so strong in that moment, now stood beside me, their faces full of concern. They never let me walk alone at night again. They made sure I was always with someone, always safe, and I couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude mixed with guilt. They had risked their own safety for me, and I would never be able to repay them. It was because of them that I didn't face another terrifying encounter until years later when I left the province. But even now, when I walk alone, I carry their protection with me in my heart. There is a certain kind of fear that stays with you, lingering like a shadow in the back of your mind, waiting for the moment when you let your guard down. And now, every time I step out alone at night, I feel it. The quiet fear that I've learned to live with. A reminder of the man who followed me, of the boys who protected me, and of the darkness that can lie just around the corner. I had always hated being alone in that house. It wasn't because it was eerie, though it had its moments, but more because of the silence. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My parents were away for the weekend, leaving me with the sprawling, run-down home that had been in our family for generations. It wasn't a mansion, just an old, weathered house on the edge of town, nestled between woods so thick you could never see past the first row of trees. The kind of place where the shadows lingered just a bit too long, no matter how many lights you turned on. I wasn't thrilled to be left alone, but I had gotten used to it. My parents took frequent trips, and I had grown comfortable in the stillness. As I walked through the front door, the familiar creak of the floorboards under my sneakers made the house feel like a friend. I threw my bag down by the stairs and headed to the kitchen, a warm, almost homey place despite its age. There was something reassuring about the worn tiles and mismatched cabinets. They reminded me of the life we'd built here. At first, it was the usual. An hour of flipping through channels, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the house settling. But then something changed. It wasn't sudden, but it was undeniable. I was in the kitchen, making a snack when I heard it. A soft scrape, like something sliding across the floor. I froze, my heart jumping into my throat. I wasn't sure what it was, but I instinctively glanced at the chair by the table. It had moved. Just a few inches, but enough to catch my attention. My first thought was that maybe it was the house. Old buildings sometimes did strange things, right? I laughed it off, shaking my head. There had to be a logical explanation. I set the bowl down, went to push the chair back into place, and froze. The chill in the air wasn't just from the open window. It was something else, something too still, too quiet. I tried to ignore it, finishing my snack and heading upstairs to get comfortable for the night. But as I passed the hallway mirror, something caught my eye. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure. Just a shadow, but distinct. I blinked, and it was gone. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was tired, but the unsettling feeling didn't go away. I tried to shake it off, settling into bed with a book, but it was impossible to focus. The house seemed to hum with a strange energy. The whispers started then. Soft at first, so faint that I thought it was just the wind. But they weren't the wind. They were words. My name. Sarah. I shot up in bed, the whisper cutting through the silence like a knife. But when I looked around, there was nothing. No one. Just the dark corners of my room, the soft moonlight creeping through the blinds. I lay back down, trying to rationalize it. It was nothing. Just nerves. The wind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I was convinced the previous night had just been a figment of my imagination, a combination of being alone for too long and the house's creaks. I decided to get some fresh air, hoping it would clear my head. The sun had risen, spilling its light through the trees, casting long, thin shadows across the yard. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air as I walked along the overgrown path at the back of the property. The woods behind the house always had a way of making me feel small, as if the trees were watching me, guarding their secrets. The peacefulness of nature did little to calm my growing sense of unease, but I tried to shake it off. I walked for a while, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot the only sound. The path eventually led me to the old shed, a building that hadn't seen much use in years. It was still standing, though, and I took comfort in that. It reminded me of the old family stories, the ones my parents used to tell about how the house had been built by my great-grandfather, how it had been passed down through generations. It had seen its share of families, each adding their own chapter to its history. But as I stood there, a sudden coldness swept over me, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the sun. I glanced around, and that's when I noticed the strange markings on the shed's wooden door. They were crude symbols. Scratches as if something had dug into the wood, leaving deep grooves. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough texture. My stomach churned. These weren't random. Someone or something had been here. My heart pounded, and I quickly stepped away from the shed, my mind racing. I tried to ignore the creeping suspicion that I was being watched. The house behind me stood like a silent sentinel, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was pulling me back in. When I returned inside, I noticed the kitchen again. The chair was back in its original position, but the air felt different. Heavier, as though the house itself had shifted in some way. I turned on the radio to fill the silence, hoping the familiar noise would distract me. But it only made it worse. The static buzzed louder than usual, and then the unmistakable whisper again. Sarah. This time, the voice was clearer, closer. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place. It was as though it had come from right behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the kitchen was empty. No one. Nothing. I didn't know whether to scream or laugh. It was absurd. I wasn't crazy, but the longer I stood there, the more it felt like something was closing in on me, like the walls were slowly inching closer. The whispers didn't stop. They followed me everywhere. While I was in the bathroom, while I ate dinner, even when I tried to sleep. By the time night fell again, I was drained. I had tried everything. Checked the windows, locked the doors, reassured myself that I was just being paranoid. But the house felt different now. The silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive, suffocating. As I lay in bed, the whisper came again. Only this time, it wasn't just my name. Come closer. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The voice sounded like it was in the room with me. The sheets seemed to tighten around me, and my heart raced. Something was in the house with me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, the darkness seemed to press against me, as if it was alive, pushing me into the bed. I kept telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Too much isolation, too much stress. But the whispers had grown louder, more persistent. They weren't just calling my name anymore. They were saying things. Cryptic things, things that didn't make sense. Come closer, you're the key. I jolted awake, my body drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was cold. The shadows in the corners seemed to writhe, twisting and turning in unnatural ways. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stared at the ceiling, willing myself to calm down. I told myself it was just the wind or my nerves, but the chill in the air wasn't from outside. It was inside. It was the house. I had to know what was happening. There was only one place I hadn't dared to go yet. The attic. It had always seemed off, like the house was hiding something up there. My parents never mentioned it, and I had never been curious enough to investigate. Until now. I stood in front of the attic door, staring at the faded wallpaper that had started to peel. The hinges squeaked as I opened it, revealing a steep set of stairs leading upward into a dark, musty space. The smell hit me first. Dust, mildew, and something else, something older. I hesitated for a moment, but the whispers called again, this time louder, more insistent. "Sarah, you have to know." I grabbed a flashlight and started my way up the stairs, the beam of light flickering in the darkness as I ascended. The higher I climbed, the more the air felt thick, as though the house itself was holding its breath. When I reached the top, I swung the flashlight across the room. Old furniture, boxes stacked high, and a faint trail of cobwebs greeted me. But it wasn't the clutter that made my stomach churn. It was the old photograph on the wall. It was a family portrait, but not of my family. It was a man, a woman, and 2 children, all standing together in front of the house. Their faces were strange, almost lifeless, and the woman, her eyes seemed to follow me. My pulse quickened as I took a step closer. The photograph looked old, maybe from the 1940s, but the people in it didn't resemble anyone I recognized. The children were too young to be any of my relatives, and the man, with his cold, calculating stare, felt wrong. I was about to turn away when I noticed something else. A small journal tucked behind the frame. I pulled it out, the leather cover worn with age. The handwriting inside was messy, frantic. It's happening again. The house calls. It wants more. It's never finished. I flipped through the pages, reading the fragmented entries. The words blurred together as my eyes skimmed over the text, but one thing stood out. The exorcism failed. It's waiting for the next one. "Sarah, you are the next." I froze. The blood drained from my face as I felt the weight of the words settle in my chest. The whispers had been right all along. The house wasn't haunted. It was cursed. The figure I had seen standing at the foot of my bed. Was it the same woman from the photograph? I couldn't be sure. But what I knew now was that the house had a history, a dark history, and it was waiting for me to finish what was started. I slammed the journal shut, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. But when I turned to the stairs, I froze. The attic door had slammed shut, and when I tried to push it open, it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The whispers were louder now, more urgent. "Finish it. Finish the exorcism." I stumbled back, my mind spinning. The air had grown colder, and the whispers were all around me, a cacophony of voices rising in pitch. The attic felt smaller now, as if the walls were closing in, the ceiling lowering. My hands trembled as I grasped the door handle again, trying to force it open. But it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had decided I wasn't leaving. Panic surged through me, my breath quickening. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one could hear me. The house was silent, save for the whispers. I was alone. The flashlight flickered and dimmed, its weak light casting long shadows across the room. My heart raced as I turned back to the old furniture, my gaze falling on the stacks of boxes and forgotten trinkets. Then something caught my eye. A large, dust-covered mirror against the far wall. I hadn't noticed it before. The air around it felt different, cold. The whispers seemed to die down as I slowly approached it. It felt wrong. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. Something in that mirror called to me, pulling me closer. I reached out, my fingers brushing the glass. A chill ran up my spine, but I couldn't look away. The reflection stared back at me. My face pale, wide-eyed, like someone had drained the life from me. But something was wrong. Behind me, just out of the frame, I saw her. The woman from the photograph. Her face was twisted, contorted with a grotesque expression, her eyes wide and empty, her mouth open in a silent scream. I whipped around, heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the same dark, empty attic. I turned back to the mirror. The woman was gone, but her presence lingered, and that was when I saw it. A dark shape, barely visible at the edge of my reflection, shifting, moving. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It wasn't the woman. It was something else. A man. Tall, his face obscured by a hood, his hands raised, as though in a gesture of command. I could feel the pressure building, suffocating me as he stepped closer. His eyes, piercing black pits, locked onto mine through the glass. I tried to look away, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, my breath shallow, my heart thundering in my ears. The figure's lips parted, and a low voice filled my mind. "You are the key, Sarah." I screamed, but no sound came out. The figure's hand reached forward, and my reflection began to change. My own eyes, my own face, twisted into something unrecognizable. It was as if the man was taking over, controlling me from within the mirror. And then, as quickly as it had all begun, the reflection returned to normal. The figure was gone. The whispers resumed, now louder, more demanding. I backed away from the mirror, my knees giving way beneath me. My head spun. What had just happened? Was it a vision, a hallucination, or had the demon truly taken root within me? But there was no time for answers. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here any longer. I turned back to the door, desperate to escape. The whispers had grown more frantic, urging me to stay, to finish the exorcism, to take control. But I refused. I didn't care what was waiting for me on the other side. I was done. With every ounce of strength I had left, I slammed my shoulder into the door. It groaned, then cracked open. I stumbled out into the hall, my breath ragged, my hands shaking. And that's when I saw it. At the end of the hallway, standing in the dark, was the same woman I had seen in the mirror. Her hollow eyes fixed on me, her mouth moving, but no sound came. She was waiting for me to finish what had been started. But I wasn't ready. I couldn't do it. Not like this. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the floorboards, the whispers growing louder in my mind. I couldn't outrun them. I couldn't outrun it. I didn't stop running. The house seemed to stretch endlessly before me, twisting and contorting in a way that defied logic. Every door I tried to open was locked, every window sealed tight. The air thickened, the oppressive weight of the house bearing down on me, like it was alive and aware of my every move. The whispers had become a maddening chorus now, all the voices blending into one, chanting my name in unison. "Sarah, Sarah," they breathed in my ears, a cold caress that made my skin crawl. I ran down the hall, my feet slapping against the wooden floor, my chest tightening with each breath I took. My mind was a blur, thoughts scattered like confetti. I had to get out. There had to be a way to escape. But the house, it wouldn't let me. I turned another corner, praying for a way out, and that's when I saw it. The old family portrait on the wall, the one I had passed dozens of times without thinking. But now it stopped me cold. The people in the photograph weren't the same as before. The faces had changed. Their eyes were black, their smiles twisted into grotesque versions of what they once were. And standing behind them, barely visible, was the figure from the mirror. The man with the hood, watching me. A voice, low, venomous, whispered in my ear. "You think you can escape? You're part of it now, Sarah." I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth as I gasped for air. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows moving in time with the whispers, a suffocating presence. My legs shook and my vision blurred. I had to keep moving, had to get out of here before I lost myself entirely. But where was I supposed to go? The front door was locked. The back door too. Every exit seemed to be blocked by something invisible, something that wanted to keep me trapped here. I turned away from the portrait, my heart pounding in my chest, but my eyes were drawn to the staircase at the far end of the hall. The attic door, the place where this nightmare had all begun. Maybe it was the only way out. I didn't think, I just acted. I ran toward the stairs, the whispers intensifying, surrounding me, their words like needles in my brain. The air felt heavier now, thick with the weight of centuries of torment. I reached the top of the stairs and stopped short. The attic door was wide open. It hadn't been that way before. The light from the hallway flickered as if protesting my presence. I could feel the oppressive cold coming from the attic, the same cold that had filled the room when I first found the journal. The house wasn't done with me. It wanted me back in the attic. It wanted me to finish the ritual. The whispers came again, louder now, more insistent. "Do it, Sarah. Complete the ritual. You are the key." I hesitated, my hand hovering just above the doorframe. My mind raced. Father Thomas's warnings, the journal, the unfinished exorcism. The ritual was the only way to end it. But the fear, the dread that washed over me, it almost felt like the house itself was breathing, urging me to take the next step. I stepped into the attic. The air was thick with dust, the room as cold as a tomb. The old furniture loomed in the corners, forgotten relics of another time. And there on the floor was the journal. The same journal from before. I crouched down and opened it to the final page. The words were scrawled hastily, almost frantically. There was no time to waste. The demon had grown stronger. The ritual had to be completed, or it would take me completely. I started to chant the words aloud, the Latin flowing from my mouth without thought. My heart raced, my hands shaking as I drew the final symbols on the floor. The whispers in my head intensified, deafening, as if the demon itself was trying to drown me in its power. I felt it. The house shook, the walls groaning under the pressure. The lights flickered and dimmed. The cold grew unbearable, freezing me to the bone. And then I saw it. The figure, the man from the mirror, emerged from the shadows in front of me, his black eyes fixed on mine. His mouth curled into a smile that was all teeth, his hands raised as if to strike. I couldn't stop. The ritual was almost complete. But then something changed. A sharp pain seared through my chest, and I screamed. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that threatened to swallow me whole. The silence was unbearable. My chest heaved, my heart pounding like a drum, each beat ringing in my ears. The air felt thick, oppressive, like I was trapped in a suffocating void. My body trembled, the last remnants of the chant fading from my lips as I struggled to stay on my feet. The figure loomed before me, its black eyes drilling into mine, its smile stretching unnaturally wide. But then something shifted. A deep sound rumbled from beneath the floorboards, like the house itself was groaning in pain. The figure faltered, its smile twitching as if it too felt the disturbance. It was working. The ritual was taking effect. I pushed forward, my hands shaking as I continued the incantation. The words came easier now, as if the house were forcing them from my lips, urging me to finish what had been started so long ago. I could feel the demon's grip tightening on my mind, its presence pressing down on me like a weight, trying to choke the life out of me. "No," I shouted, my voice cracking. "You won't win." The figure hissed, its mouth opening wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. It stepped forward, but its movement was slow, as if it were wading through thick, unseen mud. The air crackled with energy, the very fabric of the house warping as the ritual reached its climax. I could hear the whispers again, but now they were fading. They grew softer, quieter, as if the demon's influence was weakening. My hands moved without thought, drawing the final symbol on the floor, a circle of protection that would seal the demon away for good. The walls shook violently, the house creaking and groaning, as if it were coming apart at the seams. And then, just as the figure lunged forward, someone, gripped my arm. I spun, startled, and found Father Thomas standing behind me, his face pale, his eyes wide with both fear and determination. He raised his hands, chanting words I didn't understand, his voice resonating with power that made the air vibrate. "Keep going," he commanded, his grip tightening on my arm. "Don't stop. You're almost there." With Father Thomas's support, I focused all my energy on the final verse. The words were no longer my own. They flowed from some deeper place, some primal well that the house had drawn upon. I felt the energy surge through me, like lightning in my veins, and I whispered the last words of the ritual. The house screamed. It wasn't a human scream, but something much older, much darker. The walls shook violently, the floors cracking and splitting beneath my feet, as if the house itself was being torn apart. The figure, no longer smiling, let out a shriek that rattled my bones, its form flickering, dissolving into the air like smoke. And then silence. The house went still. The air lightened, the oppressive weight that had hung over everything lifting. I could breathe again. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, my body exhausted, trembling from the ordeal. Father Thomas was beside me, his hand on my shoulder, his voice soft and reassuring. "It's over," he said gently. "You did it. You've saved yourself." This is a story I haven't told anyone except my family, but it's been bothering me for years. When I was a child, our family home was divided into three: one for my uncle and his two children, another for my mother and me, and the third, which stood empty after my great-grandfather died. It was a large, ugly house that had been targeted by burglars before. The first time was before I was born. The second time I was 5 and slept through it. Another time, someone drunk was walking around our garden and rearranging things, or every day at around 3 or 4 a.m. They was standing in front of our fence and looking into the windows. When I was 7 years old, things calmed down a bit. My drunk neighbor went to jail, and with him many of these types of incidents disappeared. I remember it was a big event because my family finally allowed themselves to have animals. A neighbor was attacking other people's animals. We got 3 cats and a dog from a shelter. The other neighbors became calmer too, but I still felt uncomfortable. I was a nervous and fearful child, and after all these stories I still didn't like being left alone at home. So there was an unspoken agreement that if my uncle or cousins were leaving the house for a moment they couldn't tell me, so I didn't have to be afraid. Unfortunately, my cousin, then 23, came to see how I was doing one day. We chatted for a while, and then she told me she was going to the shop. Of course, I panicked. I didn't want to go with her, but I didn't want to stay either, so I started crying. It ended with my cousin letting me go to her room and watch cartoons, which was a pretty big deal because she was the only one with so many channels on TV. Her room was on the ground floor and had a window onto the neighbor's garden, who had a barbecue at the time. I remember she used that as another argument. If anything happens, open the window and shout to them. Then she left and I focused on the cartoons. I remember I had already watched an entire episode of Dexter's Laboratory and had switched to the channel that had the Barbie movie on when I heard some sounds. At first I assumed it was our pets, but the next sounds were more like footsteps, doors opening, etc. My cousin came back from the shop, but I didn't even finish watching Barbie. I remember being more angry than scared at that point and deciding to be quiet. So maybe it would take her a while before she threw me out her room. But the noise was really annoying, lots of footsteps, shuffling, and some barking from our dog. At one point the sounds were close to the room. My cousin had a door with a window back then, one of those where you can barely see anything and only see shadows. So when I turned around, all I saw was a figure in a gray and black outfit. Nothing special, no bright colors. It was hard to tell if it was even a man or a woman. So I once again assumed it was my cousin and decided to stay quiet, hoping she wouldn't come in. But even I was starting to feel uncomfortable because this person was standing there and do nothing in front of the door. Finally, the person turned right into the kitchen and I went back to watching cartoons. Only shortly after, what everyone probably expected happened. I heard our front door open and a loud, "I'm back," from my cousin. This time, I also heard the sound of plastic bags. I remember suddenly being completely terrified, but before I did anything my cousin went to the kitchen and nothing happened. No screaming, no fighting. I literally sat in her room, now with the cartoon sound turned off, listening, but it all sounded like normal unpacking of groceries. Then my cousin came over and I started crying. I ended up telling her what happened and she called neighbors. Together they searched the entire house, but they found no one. Nothing looked damaged, and in the next days, nothing had disappeared from our house. The rest of the family found out too. We confirmed that my uncle and mother were at work and my second cousin was at school. The day it happened, we found our cats sleeping in my great-grandfather's apartment on the second floor. But the dog was nervous and spent the entire search around neighbors and whining. We never managed to solve it, but when I spoke with my cousin recently, she admitted that she spoke to my uncle about it a few years after the event, and together they came to the conclusion that I must have imagined something. But I am 100% certain that I saw a person that day. I still think about this encounter as an adult. When I was about 10, I'm 25 now, I was downstairs watching TV late at night with my mom and sisters. Everyone decided to head off to bed and I was left alone downstairs. I started drifting off and all of a sudden someone started banging on our door hard. I'm talking let me in hard. I was so scared I just sat there frozen staring at the door like my life depended on it. My dog was laying right next to me and also just stared. He never barked or moved an inch, which was odd because he always barked at the door. The banging never stopped for what seemed like a solid 5 minutes, but in reality was probably only a minute. I looked at my dog, and I think because I finally moved, my dog snapped out of his trance, looked at me for a split second, and jumped up and ran towards the door. He still didn't bark, but instead started turning his head like he was confused. I finally got the courage to get up and open the blinds to see what was going on, and this young woman, maybe around 20-25, was standing there holding her left breast in her hand. It was still attached to her, but she had pretty large breast, and she was holding it trying to keep them up from sagging, I'm guessing. She had blonde hair, white skin, and was covered in blood. Her shirt was ripped and her hair was a mess. I remember thinking she may have gotten beat up or was in a car crash. Either way, I immediately went to go open the door. As soon as I went to unlock it, my mom out of nowhere slammed her hand on the door and relocked it. I had no idea she had even come down the stairs, let alone walked up behind me. I was so focused on the door and on this woman that when she slammed her hand, it was almost if it knocked me back into reality. Reality of not opening the door for strangers in the middle of the night. I looked up at her and I could feel my eyes were wide, and I think I even started crying. She put her hand on my shoulder and moved me away from the door. She yelled, "Who is it?" through the door, and the girl yelled back that her boyfriend had beat her up, and they lived in the apartments across the street from us. Mind you, we lived in townhouses in a cul-de-sac. Our unit was all the way in the back where you would start the turn. We were the first unit in the row, but where she pointed out her and her boyfriend's place was quite a ways away from us. You'll see how I know that in a minute. My mom asked her name, and she said something that sounded like something Annie. Maybe Bethany or Stephanie or something like that. I saw my mom hesitate to open the door, but after she yelled, "Please help me," my mom opened the door, stepped out, and pulled it close to shut, but not completely shut. I cracked the door behind her to make sure she was okay and also see what was going on. The women we'll call Bethany kept thanking my mom and asking to come in because she was scared her boyfriend was going to come after her. My mom refused and explained that she couldn't let her in because of the safety of her 4 kids, but said she would sit out there with her. My mom yelled at me to grab the phone and call the police, so I did. My mom started asking her what happened and what specific unit she lived in. She pointed towards her specific one and told my mom the building number and her unit B. This silver SUV pulled up a little later, and she ran towards it yelling, "That's my sister," and then just jumped in. The car sped off without another word from her or a single word from the sister. My mom looked back at me confused and came back inside and shut and locked the door. We just stood there and looked at each other. I asked my mom what about the police, and she said she would wait for them downstairs if I wanted to go to bed. I was too scared to leave her, so I waited with her. Once they arrived, my mom explained what happened, and the officer said she did the right thing not letting her inside. Weird thing is, my dog never barked once until the cops knocked on the door. They also explained that they've been receiving similar calls like that in the area recently. Even worse, the next morning we all packed up to go to the grocery store, and as we passed that building, you could tell the apartment was empty, like no one had been living in it. Maybe they just didn't have any furniture or anything, but it was still weird. He never came after her that night, and we never saw her or the SUV again. Bethany and Stephanie, I hope you're okay if this was real, but also if it's not. Don't ever knock on my door again. Update: I did ask my mom to elaborate on everything. So, after my mom yelled for me to call the police, I walked away to grab the landline in the kitchen. When I walked away, my mom said this to her: "Now you listen to me. If you are trying to get over on me and hurt my family, I will do worse than what you're pretending your boyfriend did to you, and I will kill you. Nothing means more to me than my children, not my life and not my freedom. I will help you if you need it, but you cannot enter my home, so don't ask again, or I'm going inside, and I will lock you out and not help you. Do you understand?" I asked her what the girl said and did after that, and she said she just looked at her kind of nervous and said she understood and appreciated us helping her. That's about the time I returned to the door after calling the police and heard my mom asking her what happened and where she lived, etc. Needless to say, but my mom was a boss in that moment. I tried to escape the rain in a rundown cabin. It wasn't as abandoned as I thought. So, I'm an avid hiker, and I go after this hobby whenever I can. Despite knowing it would be safer, I don't like taking people with me. I make up for it by telling my friends where I'm headed and when to expect me to come back though. This way, if anything should happen to me and I'm unable to call for help, there's always going to be someone who knows that I'm gone and where to look for me. Not that I often go anywhere that's particularly dangerous. I mostly just drive out to this hilly stretch of woodland that's about an hour away from where I live. There are a lot of different signposted trails there, and even though I've taken all of them at least once before, I don't mind doing it again. When this happened, I was hiking up a longer path. All the trails go around the forest in a loop, so you'll come back out right where you started from. The one I chose involves a pretty steep ascent, so it's slightly more challenging than some of the others. It made me sweat a good deal, but since it wasn't my first time, I was doing just fine until it started raining. The weather forecast had predicted nothing but a cloudy sky and mild temperatures, so this was completely out of the blue. It was a strong kind of rain, too. Before long, the water was whipping in my face and coming down hard. I needed to get myself somewhere dry, or it'd start kneading me like dough. Of course, I hadn't brought an umbrella, so I ended up running into the woods for cover. For a while, I crouched down under a big tree, and it did shield me from the rain for a few minutes. I figured I could wait it out. But then there was this loud cracking noise behind me, and I turned just in time to watch a huge branch break off another tree and crash down below. Without me noticing, the wind had picked up and was now causing the bushes and treetops to shudder violently. I didn't want a branch like that coming down on me, so I hastily rushed back out onto the trail. With how far I'd walked already, my only option was to keep walking until I'd come back out. Pressing on was difficult. The rain was icy and made me shiver even through my jacket. Then, all of a sudden, I remembered there was an old, abandoned cabin off to the side a little way up the trail. Hopeful once more, I began to jog, shielding my eyes from the falling water with my hands as I looked around trying to locate the small wooden building. Finally, I spotted the structure in the distance and started making my way up to it. Praying that it wasn't locked, I rattled on the doorknob. The door swung open with an obedient creak, and I staggered inside before slamming it shut behind me. I dropped my backpack before peeling off my wet jacket and desperately rubbing my arms to warm them up. It was surprisingly warm inside the cabin and pleasantly dry. It smelt like old wood, but nothing I wouldn't be able to ignore. I was beyond relieved that the door had been open. Looking around, I took in my surroundings. There wasn't a lot of furniture left inside. I was standing in what must have been the living room at some point, judging from the sad-looking ragged couch that stood in the middle of it. There was a tiny open kitchen in the back, and also a staircase that probably led down to the basement, but I didn't feel like checking it out. There was a good chance the steps would break down as soon as I'd put weight onto them. Turning my attention to the windows, I found that one of them was broken, but had been pieced back together with duct tape. I tentatively gave it a poke with the tip of my finger, which it withstood. I hoped it would outlast the storm. The sound of thunder rolling came from outside, and I flinched at how loud it was. I really had been lucky to have made it to the cabin in time. I was hesitant to get comfortable on the couch for fear of the tiny life forms that might have taken up residence inside it over time, but it still beat sitting on the floor. So I sank down on the saggy cushions and took out my cell phone. Of course, I had no reception whatsoever. At least I had some offline games to play while I was waiting for the storm to die down. After half an hour, I realized that wasn't going to happen anytime soon though. I would have to go easy on the battery if I wanted to have some left by the time I got out of there, so I sat aside my phone and started looking through my backpack for something else to keep myself busy with. I found a worn novel I had crammed in there and forgotten ages ago, so I started reading. I still had a bunch of snacks and water, so I ate and drank until my stomach felt pleasantly full. The wind was howling outside, and I kept hearing thunder clapping. The sky was growing darker too. I noticed that it was getting harder to read with how little light was finding its way into the windows. This concerned me a bit, and I wondered how long exactly I would end up stuck in the cabin. Things were looking pretty grim out there, and I wasn't too keen on spending the night in a place like this, even though it did feel kind of adventurous. I continued to read for as long as what remained of the day's light allowed me, but that was hardly another hour. The hut looked spooky in the darkness. It wasn't exactly pitch black, but enough to make me uneasy. The only thing to illuminate the living room was the occasional flash of lightning from outside. I moved over on the couch so I could watch the storm through one of the windows. Thunder rolled once again, and then, all of a sudden, a male voice cut through the silence left in its wake. 7, 6, 11, 5, 9, and 20 mile today. I jolted upright. For a second, my head had just gone completely empty. Then I glanced around frantically before realizing that nobody had actually spoken to me. The voice was deep and eerily resonant, but it had a crackly undertone to it. It was a recording. But my relief upon realizing this was short-lived. There was a strange recording playing somewhere nearby, somewhere close to me. Somebody had just turned it on. 4/11/1732 the day before. The recording stopped. It had only been playing for mere seconds, but I could tell that it was coming from downstairs from the basement. The abrupt way it had been turned off made me think that whoever was down there had only turned it on accidentally. They'd never wanted me to know I was not alone. It was only then that I realized I was still sitting on the couch, frozen in place like a statue, staring at the basement entrance. I instantly jumped to my feet and picked up my jacket, struggling to put it on while at the same time trying to shove my belongings back into my backpack. I had to get out of there. I didn't care about the rain or the lightning or the falling branches anymore. I just needed to get out. Then I heard footsteps. They were hasty, fast, and they were moving up the stairs. Stifling a scream, I abandoned my backpack and simply burst through the door, sprinting out into the cold. Despite the darkness, I could see the trail ahead, just a small distance away from the cabin. I leapt towards it, and when I'd reached it, I just kept on running as fast as my legs would carry me. I hurriedly patted down my jacket. I could feel my cell phone, wallet, and keys in my pockets, which immediately made me feel light with relief. There was also a can of pepper spray somewhere in there, which I figured was better than nothing if, God forbid, whoever had been in the cabin would catch up with me. Thankfully, it never came to that. By some miracle, I found my way back to my car. I instantly locked it upon jumping inside. I was completely drenched and utterly exhausted. It took me ages to catch my breath. I sat in the car for around half an hour, shaking and crying, before finally managing to pull myself together. Realizing I shouldn't hang around, I started driving. I was way too tired to make it all the way back home, so I just stopped at this dingy little motel that's 15 minutes away from the hiking spot and got a room there for the night. I basically collapsed on the bed. I didn't know whether or not to call the police. I've had some bad experiences with the local authorities before, so I decided not to, at least not right away. It's a trust thing, I guess. What I did was I called my brother and told him everything, asking him if he and I could go back to the place together to see what was up with it. He readily accepted, and we came up with the following plan. My brother, being a huge guy himself, would come to pick me up in the morning with one or two of his friends, and we would return to the woods as a group so no one would try to mess with us. We'd go up to the cabin, retrieve my lost belongings, and take a look at it. But I also had to promise him that if we were to find evidence of something bad going on there, we'd call the cops. He showed up in his truck the following day as promised, with another man with him. We headed back to the hiking spot and made our way up the trail. The storm had left its impact on the woods quite clearly. Broken branches were scattered everywhere, and some of the young, thin, and more fragile trees had been knocked over completely, basically torn out at the roots. The cabin, however, had endured. Its door was wide open when we reached it. We entered it one right after the other. I could tell the guys were just as nervous as I was. No doubt they were taking what I'd told them quite seriously. Still, We were all prepared to defend ourselves if someone was to charge at us unexpectedly. My backpack wasn't in the upstairs room, which to me could only mean that somebody had moved it. When my brother said we'd have to go down into the basement, I was understandably reluctant at first, but he reminded me that we had agreed on this earlier, so it was too late for me to chicken out. Each stair let out an agonized creak as we put our weight on it, and I feared the rickety old things really would end up breaking down. My brother's friend stayed upstairs so he could get us out in case that would really happen, but to my surprise, it never did. Soon enough, we found ourselves in a room that was just as big as the living room. There was enough light falling in from upstairs for us to see everything, and what we saw was not nice. First, there was the tape recorder. It sat right in the middle of the floor, like it had been propped up for us to find right away. My brother went up to it and turned it on. I flinched as I heard the same warped male voice start to speak. It sounded just as eerie as before. My brother's friend suddenly called out to us from upstairs, "Is that Boots?" "What do you mean?" I asked. "That's Boots. It's this poem by Rudyard Kipling, I think. I don't know who did that reading, but it's creepy as hell. I heard it's used to simulate torture or something, like for Navy SEAL training. I don't know." By the way, it really was Boots. That's why I don't feel the need to transcribe the recording here exactly, since you can just look it up. That was the first thing to give us a really queasy feeling, though. While the room was largely empty, a single cardboard box that had been pushed up to the wall stood out. My brother took a look inside without touching it, then he waved me over. Upon bending down beside him to check it out, I found that it held several rolls of duct tape, a bunch of plastic bags, some cable binders, and a lot of small gardening tools like a little hoe, secateurs, and a saw. We also found cleaning supplies in another corner of the room, right next to two buckets with plastic lids on top. The second I opened one of them, a putrid smell came wafting out, strong enough to send me and my brother reeling backwards. I cursed and immediately covered my nose and mouth, hurriedly moving in again to shut the damn thing, but in my haste, I knocked it over. We stumbled aside as viscous brown and red liquid spilled onto the floor at our feet. Feces and blood. "Oh, come on, we're getting out of here," my brother yelled, grabbing me by the wrist and starting to drag me back up the stairs. That very moment, however, something caught my eye out of a darkened corner of the room. "Wait," I told him, pulling my hand out of his grasp and pointing at what I had just seen. It was my backpack, hung up on a nail jutting out of the wall. How had I not noticed it sooner? I had to cautiously step over the pool of blood on the floor to reach it, but eventually I managed to grab it and then leapt back over to my brother. We ran up the stairs and left the cabin with our third companion, and as soon as we were back in the car, he called the police while I began to rummage through my backpack. Everywhere was how I'd left it. Nothing had been taken out. There was something else, though. I found it tucked between the pages of the book I'd been reading. It was this torn-off piece of paper with a brief note scrawled onto it. Just a few words, but enough to make my stomach turn. Slippery little thing. I'm not really sure why I waited so long to tell this story because this happened back in early August. I've been a lurker for a while, and reading some of these stories brought the memories of this cabin back. Keep in mind, I'm no writer, so sorry if this sucks. On August 13-16, 2014, I stayed in a cabin in Tennessee with my grandparents. It was a nice cabin, keep in mind. It wasn't exactly as clean as it was in the picture, but it was nice. As you can see in the picture, there is the upstairs, and from up there at the pool table you can look over the banister and see the downstairs. My grandparents slept in the downstairs bedroom, and while I tried to sleep on the couch downstairs, I could only ever get an hour or two of sleep before I went upstairs to sleep in the bed with my sister. I have difficulty explaining this part, so I hope you can see from the pictures on the website. But right as you walk up the stairs and you get to the top, there is a dresser. I'm sure these pictures are probably from years back because, like I said, the cabin looked much cleaner in the pictures. The floor in front of the dresser was stained a dark brown color, and as I've learned from horror movies and stories, it was probably blood. I wish I had a picture, but it was on my old cell phone that got broken. When you're downstairs, you can't see the bed because right behind the dresser is a short wall that doesn't go all the way across the room, and behind the wall is the bed. I can't remember which night it was, but one night as I got in the bed with my sister, right before I fell asleep, it felt as though something punched me. That's the only way I can think to explain it. It wasn't painful though, and it didn't hit my face. It's hard to explain, but it basically felt like some air knocked my head back. I was laying in the bed facing the wall behind the dresser, and it was the strangest thing. It knocked my face back as if something punched me, but like I said, it wasn't painful. My sister also asked me if I had heard footsteps on the stairs, which I had. I thought they were just my grandma or grandpa coming to check on us, because we're still only teenagers and my grandma loves to worry, but they had said they didn't go up the stairs at all those nights. And it's strange to think that I didn't feel threatened at all there. I know this pales in comparison to most stories on here, but looking back, I can't believe I wasn't as terrified there as I am thinking about it. I'm guessing this is the subreddit to put it on. I hope it is. And I honestly plan on going back there someday, just to see if anything else happens. I wish I had some pictures from my stay there, but I hope the ones from the website are good enough to at least show what it looked like. Sorry if there are any mistakes, by the way. I'm typing on my phone. This is my first post, and I'm not sure if this is the right place for it, but I wanted to share my horrifying experience from high school. High school was 4 of the greatest years in my life. Things were so much simpler back then than they currently are. Now I am 25 years old with 6 years of service in the Navy, and looking back, those times seem so long ago. I always reminisce on all the good times I had with my friends. We were a close group, always getting together after school or going out on the weekends. My head swells with so many fond memories I have had with them, so many great memories. Except one. One memory that, when I think back to it, still sends a chill down my spine. It was our senior year, 2008, and graduation was just around the corner. We were all excited to be moving ahead with our lives. I was joining the military and the rest were going to different colleges. I will admit it was a bittersweet moment. Yes, we were excited for the future, but a bit sad knowing our group would not be whole like it was throughout high school. My friends decided they were going to give me an awesome going-away celebration. The plan was to pitch in some money and have my older brother rent us a cabin in the mountain for the weekend. We packed our bags and drove up the mountain to the cabin. There was a small town nearby and our cabin was about half a mile down the road. There were a few other cabins nearby, but ours was at the edge of town surrounded by woods. We unpack our things and head inside. We were not disappointed. The living and dining room was enormous with a big L-shaped couch and a long table with plenty of chairs. We had a good-sized television and even a pool table. There were 3 separate bedrooms down the hall with 2 beds each. There were 7 of us, so I volunteered to sleep on the couch. I didn't really care, it was comfy as hell anyways. The only problem I had was that the couch was next to this sliding glass door that for some reason had no blinds or drapes. I was not about to admit to everyone that it bothered me. As soon as we were unpacked, we decided to get the good time started. My brother and a couple others went into town to buy alcohol and food, while the rest of us prepared for the night's festivities. We ate, we drank, played some drinking games like beer pong, which I was never good at, and had a good time. Later that evening, we were all gathered in the living room talking about funny moments we had had in high school. We were all feeling pretty good from all the alcohol consumption. As I was telling one of my stories, we heard a female friend of mine shriek, "Oh my God." It startled the shit out of us, and we quickly turned our heads to her, standing in front of the sliding glass door. She quickly turns around with the biggest smile and says, "You guys, it's snowing." We all run to the window like children, and sure enough, there is a good amount of snow falling from the sky. We go outside, and as the snow builds up, we have a good snowball fight and build ourselves a crappy snowman. After a while, we get tired and go inside. Running around in our lack of sobriety caused a couple of my friends to puke. It was late, and we all decided to turn in for the night. We had planned to buy a sled in town and find a snowy hill in the morning. We all went to our rooms and fell asleep. I was awoken in the middle of the night to what I thought was a stick or branch cracking in the distance. I laid there for a few minutes, trying to see if I heard it again, or if it was just my imagination. Nothing. I told myself I was hearing things. I got up to drink a bottle of water. I did not want to wake up the next morning with a nasty hangover. As I walked by the sliding glass door, I looked outside. Snow was still falling, just not as much, and the moon gave the snow an eerie blue glow. I went to the kitchen and grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. As I drank, I got lost in my thoughts. I was going to miss times like these with my friends. Did I make the right decision joining the military? I was contemplating my future when I was suddenly snapped back into reality by the sound of crunching. I listened, trying to figure out what exactly that sound was. It slowly got louder, then stopped. Then it slapped me in the face. Footsteps in the snow. I immediately turned my head to the sliding glass window. My heart skipped a beat. A shock of pins and needles ran down my skin. There at the sliding glass window was a dark silhouette of a man. His right hand was cupped around his eyes, and he was peering in, surveying the living room. I was frozen, confused, wondering who this was looking in. He must not have seen me, for he was still moving his head, looking around. It was only when he lifted his left hand and cupped it around the other side of his face that my confusion turned to horror. In his left hand he held a hatchet. I just stood there and watched as he looked inside. He put his hands down and looked down to his right towards the door handle and began reaching for it. That's when I noticed it and my heart stopped. In our drunken stupidity, we forgot to lock the door when we came back inside from playing in the snow. I panicked when his hand gripped the door handle. "See, can I help you?" I said loudly, trying to sound intimidating, but clearly sounding scared. It startled the man, for he quickly looked up in my direction. We stared at each other for what seemed like hours, but were merely seconds. I could not see his face, but I could feel his eyes piercing my soul. He let go, slowly backed away, and started jogging away. He didn't break eye contact with me until he was a good 15 feet from the cabin. One of my friends who woke up to my shouting came to the living room and asked who I was talking to and why I was standing in the dark. I locked the door in a hurry, and he could tell there was something wrong. He looked out the glass door and caught a glimpse of the man, a second before he disappeared into the woods. "What the hell is that?" I woke everyone up and told them what happened. We were all shitting bricks. Needless to say, we all decided to nope the F out of there the next morning, and none of us were going to sleep the rest of the night. As we left the next morning, hundreds of thoughts ran through my head. What if I didn't sleep in the living room? If there was nobody there with the door left unlocked, what could have happened? What were his intentions with that hatchet? We'll never know, and it's sad to say that my last memory together with my friends was a horrible one. This was one of the most creepy and traumatizing things that has ever happened to me. I was staying with my family, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, and in a frame and chalet-styled cabin in northern Washington. Washington has a lot of forests and densely wooded areas. This cabin was also on a lake, and we brought our small lake boat with us. This trip was mostly so we could try out our new boat. Everything was going well. We were having fun on the lake, hanging out with family, and just generally having a good vacation. My family decided to go to a convenience store and leave me alone in the cabin. This happened a while ago, but I was old enough to stay home alone. The nearest convenience store was about 30-45 minutes down a dirt road. As you may have expected, this is where it started to go wrong. They leave. I volunteered to stay home because I am relaxing and don't want to have to get in a car. About 15 minutes after they leave, it started to get dark. I am walking around listening to music and enjoying the sunset perfectly framed over the lake. Chalets generally have pretty large windows, and this specific cabin did not have curtains. This made watching the sunset pretty enjoyable, but did not help once the sun fully set. Washington is known for its forests and is also known for Bigfoot. This story is not related to Bigfoot as it is just a legend. I am just pointing that out for reference. So at this point I am messing around and exploring the cabin more because the sun has now set, and there isn't really much besides dark, kind of creepy forest and the lake outside of the window. As I am messing around, something catches my eye. I swore I could have saw very slight movement down by the small boat dock, about 125 meters down a small windy path and hill. I didn't really think much of it as I was in the forest, and there are many animals that could have been moving around. Deer, moose, etc. At this point I have forgotten about the movement I saw and head to the bathroom, which is down a hallway away from the window. While I was in the bathroom, I just got this terrible feeling like something was wrong. I wanted to go check to see if there was anything inside the cabin or anything outside. I couldn't do this, however, because I was, well, using the bathroom. The longer I stayed in the bathroom, the worse the feeling got. Every drop of rain landing on the roof felt like the tick of a clock counting down to the end of the world. I quickly finished up in the restroom and practically sprinted down the hall. I looked out the large set of windows and saw nothing but the lifeless forest and the moonlight reflecting off of the lake. I then start to feel that stereotypical feeling of being watched. Generally, nothing even is watching you. Or so you think. This time, there was something watching me. I turned around and looked down the hall at the other clear glass door at the end of the hallway. Standing on the other side of that door is a freaking deer standing on two legs. My mind instantly screams, Skinwalker. I try not to acknowledge it. I close my eyes and sprint back to the bathroom, locking myself in the bathroom as it is the only room without windows. I sit there in silence, barely breathing for what felt like 12 years. My family finally got back, and I came out of the bathroom. Nothing was there, and after checking the next morning, there were no signs anything ever had been there. You can choose whether to believe me or not. You can choose whether to believe that it was all in my head. But even if it was all in my head, it still truly was a scary experience. So I used to work at a pretty remote camping spot with some cabins for people to rent. This story happened about 5 years ago, but is still pretty freaky when I think of it. I'm a small 5'6" woman, and on this night, the only other person working with me was Max, an even smaller woman with anger issues this matters, so we were sticking together all through the night. Around 11 we get a call from one of the rented cabins complaining of loud knocking. We get our flashlights and make our way to the cabin that called Cabin 4 and meet with the renters. They tell us they heard some loud knocking coming from outside, like someone was running along the outside knocking their fist along the wall. We go check it out and find nothing, so we report back to them to tell them it was probably pine cones falling or something. They say okay, and we leave them to try and get some sleep. Me and Max hang out at the main cabin talking about our plans for the weekend, until we hear a knocking sound outside. Max goes outside to check it out, only to find nothing. As soon as she came back inside and sat back down, it started again. She gets ticked and yells at them to stop, assuming it was the couple pranking us. It stops for a bit before starting up again and stopping when she yells. The third time it starts, she gets on the phone and goes off at the couple, only for them to say that they were at their cabin and were also hearing the knocking. Now we're all freaked out, so the couple comes up to the main cabin, and we all wait for it to start again. It does, and Max storms outside with one of the men behind her and yells that she's calling the cops a bluff. We could only call the other cabins from our phone, and our phones didn't work. Throughout the night, this pattern would repeat, the knocking and Max yelling. Eventually, the sun came up, and we all went outside and found footprints all around the cabin. We didn't personally check the couple's cabin, but they left real quick and said there also were footprints there. We told our boss, who said he would look into it, a lie, he did nothing, and said we were being dramatic. Both me and Max continued working there for a couple months, both of us carrying mace and Max with a knife. But eventually I left for college and Max quit soon after. We still talk and often bring this story up at parties, only to scare and confuse people. I don't have much time. My name is Nova Vale. I moved into a cabin not too long ago. The area is rural and rough, with trees as far as the eye can see. My nearest neighbor is probably an hour away. It's after me, and I will never escape it. This is not what I wanted to happen. On my first day here, I unpacked and settled in. The living room was dusty, and there were some leaves on the ground. I swept the living room and cleaned up spider webs that had gathered in the windows. There's a fireplace on the left wall of the cabin. It's strange, there's this eerie painting of a woman above it. She has black hair, her skin is pale, and her eyes are so black. It's as if her iris and pupil were the same color. Whatever. The old owners must have left it here. I'll call them soon to see if they can take it. I'm planning on putting my TV there. I cleaned up the fireplace and unpacked all my things. My couch, coffee table, and everything else. As I was walking up the stairs, I heard footsteps. There should be nobody else here. Whatever, I'm probably just hearing things. I walked left into the hall and finally reached my bedroom. I hauled the boxes that contained my bed and bedroom furniture up the stairs and assembled everything. Gosh, I'm tired. I'm going to get some sleep. As I fell asleep, I swear, for a split second, I saw someone in the doorway. On my second day here, I woke up in the early hours. I heard loud bangs and knocks downstairs. I checked the clock, it was 4:27. Who the hell is knocking at this hour? I'll just ignore it. I'm tired and I have a lot of work to do. I fell back asleep. I woke up around 10:20 and walked downstairs to cook myself breakfast on the dirty stove. Ugh, I seriously need to clean this thing. I walked to where the dining table was supposed to be and realized, oh my gosh, I forgot to assemble it. Whatever. I walked to the couch and sat down. Wait. What the hell? Right in front of me was some ash on the ground. I cleaned up the fireplace, I never lit it back up. I probably stepped in some ash and didn't even realize it. Right. Knock, knock, knock. My eyes darted straight to the door. Now what? Knock, knock, knock. I walked to the door, and as I was about to open it, my stomach immediately sank. It's not possible. I haven't changed my mailing addresses or anything, but oh my gosh, what am I doing? It felt as if my body had a mind of its own. I opened the door. It was a woman. She was pale and had black eyes, almost as if her iris and pupil were the same color. She seemed familiar. Hello, I uttered. Something about this wasn't right. The woman didn't say a thing. Ma'am, are you lost? Is everything okay? Do I need to call for help? I asked her. She began to develop a slight smirk on her face, which made me slightly shudder. The woman raised her hand and pointed behind her without looking. She pointed at a tree. Weird. She then put her hands down. Don't answer the door, she said in a raspy voice. Is this woman okay? She had red marks on her neck, and she looked so thin. She walked away, and I shut the door, locking it behind me. I locked all the windows in the house, both downstairs and upstairs. I pulled up the curtains and closed them. I knew what this was. I grabbed water and food. I couldn't let anyone else know I was here. I grabbed anything necessary, halted upstairs, and entered my room. I was shaking with fear. I closed and locked the door behind me. I could stay in here as long as I needed. I would be safe here, I thought. On my third day here, the peace was broken. That woman, she seemed so familiar, like the woman in the painting. Oh my gosh, the footprints, those had to be hers, right? I haven't been able to sleep. I don't know for sure if something's wrong. No, I do know. Nothing feels right. I haven't left my room since yesterday's events took place. I'm too terrified. I won't speak and I won't move. As I'm writing this, I don't think I have much time left. I'm shaking and trembling. That woman, that woman, that woman. Ever since I saw her and looked into her lifeless eyes, I have this nauseous feeling. I feel sick. I feel horrible. I cannot explain it. I'm going to call the man who sold me this cabin. No wonder it was so cheap. There's something wrong, and I know it. I dialed his number. Ring, ring, ring. Hello, this is Jerry Frederick. Who am I speaking to? A voice said on the other end of the line. Hi, it's Nova. You sold a cabin to me, I said quietly. Ah, yes. Hello. Is there something wrong? He asked. Yeah, actually there is. Before I tell you that, is there any bad history to these woods? I wouldn't want to, live in dangerous woods, you know, I replied. Well, I'm sorry I didn't tell you this before. I just needed to get rid of the cabin. Fast. You see, the woods there were owned by many women and men, but something otherworldly happened and the women began dying rapidly, acts of unaliving themselves and murders. It's a tragedy, really. A lot of the women's spirits never found rest, so now people say they torment anyone who trespasses on their land. My wife, Mary, was a victim of the otherworldly massacre. I couldn't stand the thought of her spirit never finding peace, so I just left. Honestly, I wish I had never done that. I'm sorry, Nova. I don't think I will be returning. She won't be at peace until she can take another soul with her. It won't be me. I truly am sorry, Miss Vale. He explained. Beep, beep, beep. He hung up. He hung up on me. I can't let her get to me. I shouldn't have moved here. I'm leaving. It's my 3rd day, I know, but I am leaving. It's my 4th day here. I couldn't sleep at all. I shouldn't have talked to that woman. I'm hearing scratches at my window and loud banging. I know she will find a way in soon, and when she does, she will take me with her. Bang, bang, bang. I know it's her banging at the door. I know she wants her rest, and I know she will do anything to get it. Pit, pat, pit, pat. I know she has gotten inside, and I know she will find me soon. I hear her walking up the stairs. My time has come. She will be here soon enough. I should have never moved here, and I should have never answered the door. Creak, creak, creak. It's 4:25 a.m. She will find me soon enough. I'm trembling and shaking while I'm writing this. My door is locked, but I know she will find a way in. It's 4:26 a.m. Pit, pat, pit, pat. She has stopped outside my door. I'm trying to be as quiet as I can be. There is no difference because I know she will find me. It's 4:27 a.m. Bang, bang, bang. Rattle, rattle, rattle. The door creaks open slowly. The figure of a thin-looking woman stands in the doorway. In July 2015, I was on a hike with my husband and 2 friends. We also had our dog with us. We live in Western Washington, and that time of year it stays lightish until 9 to 10 p.m. It was about 7:30 p.m. as we headed up. The trail peaks at a beautiful lake with a loop trail that brings you back to the original trail. I ordered to descend. Light or not, it was late enough evening that many people passed us on their way down as we headed up. You can see the entirety of the lake from the top of the trail, and we were clearly the last people up there. As we made our way back down, it was starting to get dark. Strangely, we crossed paths with a man making his way up towards the lake. He was not dressed in a way that would suggest he was camping or even hiking. He had regular sneakers, a t-shirt, and shorts. No water, no pack, nothing. We tried to make conversation, but he would not speak or make eye contact. My dog whined and sniffed his feet and wanted to run back to him. I had to call her off several times. The whole interaction seemed so odd. We could not shake the feeling that he was incredibly out of place. About 25 minutes later, we heard a single gunshot. He had killed himself. At the parking lot to the trail, there was one remaining car. We assumed it must have been his. It was unlocked, and there was an envelope on the driver's seat, both observed through the window. Didn't open the door. We notified the ranger that stayed in a cabin at the edge of the parking lot, who said he'd call the police. But he wasn't risking running into a cougar to go up and check on the guy. He's not the first and won't be the last, were his exact words. I wish I would have thought to ask, "Are you okay?" or anything at all. I went to a typical YMCA summer camp when I was in middle school. It was a 2-week session every summer, and it was exhaustingly fun. We'd stay up all night telling stories or daring each other to do stuff. One night, we planned a pillow raid on a girl's cabin, where we would sneak through the woods with pillows and creep into their cabin for a pillow fight. This was to retaliate for the same girls throwing our clotheslines into a tree. We snuck over to their cabin and walloped everyone with pillows. Counselors began yelling and shining lights as we all ran off. I lost the group, but my friend Brad and I stayed in pursuit of someone who went in a different direction. We assumed they knew a shortcut or secret way back. They ended up diving into a bush somewhere off the path in the woods between the boys' and girls' cabins, and Brad and I followed quietly. We squatted down in the bush next to an individual who was not part of our cabin and wasn't involved in the pillow fight either. Confused about whether we should stay quiet or run, I screamed and grabbed Brad to run with me. I remember seeing this individual's eyes as they raised a finger to try to shush us, but we bolted. When we got back to the cabin, we tried to recount what happened. It became clear that the person in the woods was a creep who was coincidentally watching the girls' cabin. This has happened several times by now. It started about 16 months ago when I was cleaning my house around 12 a.m. My boyfriend at the time worked nights, so I had adjusted to his schedule. I usually kept the blinds open during the day and would close them at night while tidying up before bed. Our room was my last stop on the first night this happened. The curtains and blinds were open as I was sweeping the floor when I felt the sensation of being watched. I looked around and then noticed a silver sedan parked outside my house, mostly on the grass in my front lawn. For context, my bedroom window is about 15 yards from the road in front of my house. It's a small front yard in a pretty densely populated neighborhood. Anyway, I saw the car before I saw the person. I'm not sure if it was a man or a woman, but there was clearly someone sitting in the driver's seat of the car, and another person was standing about 5 yards from my window, staring at me. The only reason I could see this was because the moon was fairly bright that night. I shrieked, dropped to the floor, and crawled to the light switch to turn it off so I couldn't be seen. I called my husband to ask what I should do, and he told me to call the cops. I did, but of course, by the time they got there, the car was gone. They asked if they could see my security footage, and I agreed, but the footage from that time period was just gone. It skipped over the few minutes they would have been outside. This has happened several times since then, and I've completely given up on calling the police, as I feel like they think I'm crazy. I have no proof that this is happening, but I would like to hear some opinions on what they might be doing. In the past 16 months, it's happened probably 10 times. Sometimes the person is standing in the yard, and sometimes they aren't. Also, the car has been different every single time, but the light inside the vehicle is always on. However, when I try to look, the people inside are never positioned where I can see their faces. I'll run to grab my phone to call anyone, but they are always gone by the time I return. When I was a kid, I used to dream every night, but as I got older, my dreams slowly faded with time. There was one dream I continuously had for an extended period of time, and it never fully evolved past a certain point until one night. It would always start with me being in a cabin, a warm, cozy cabin in a huge pine forest. I remember laying in a bed on a cozy summer evening, looking at the cream-colored curtains that would sway in the breeze of the open window. Every time something would make me get up and go outside to the vast forest, the giant pine trees reaching for the amber-colored sky as dusk was settling in. The dream would always start off as this, but in the beginning I would wake up before much else happened. The dream would slowly progress to me walking around this cabin, until one day I saw a red note on the ground. It was no larger than a regular business card you'd see in your regular store. As the dream progressed with time, the warm glow of the sky would get darker and darker, and eventually turned into a moonlit sky with no clouds. But every time I would find an oddly placed red note on the ground, placed on the ground in front of a large parting in the vast trees, in what looked like an endless road into nothingness. Slowly, the dreams would feel closer to nightmares, as every time I would find this note, I would begin to hear faint screams in the distance, what almost sounded like foxes yowling, but to me it always sounded more humanoid. The last time I remember this dream, it started from the very beginning, the sway of the curtains in the breeze, but it was now pitch black outside, no more comfort from the warm amber glow of the sky like previously. Something in me still stepped outside of the cabin, and there it was, the red note, like all the other times. There was never anything on the small slip of paper, it was a deep crimson red. Something was different this time. As I picked up the slip of paper, my whole body froze. I would hear what sounded like a woman wailing in the distance, blood-curdling screams of someone or something down that parting in the trees. This time I couldn't see what was up ahead. The moonlit sky was overcast. It was darker than ever before. The last thing I remember is the croaking of a woman as if her neck had been snapped. The blood gurgling in her throat was now directly in front of me. I couldn't see her. I was jolted awake from the dream when a hand came out of the darkness, reaching for my face. To this day, I haven't had that same dream, and it's been close to 20 years. As I got older, I began to realize the vague parts of the cabin I remember was that of my grandmother's house. Her sister fell out of a large pine tree on the property and snapped her neck on impact before my mother was born. Thanks for listening. If you like our work, do subscribe because your support helps us keep this channel alive.